Okay, absolute value equations. So before we get into examples, what it means to be an absolute value equation, we've talked about absolute value before, right? What does absolute value mean? Distance from zero. Keep that in mind. If you keep that in mind, it's going to make things a lot easier. Absolute value, means distance from zero. It's not opposite. And I know a lot of the times we think about absolute value, it's always positive. It's the positive version of that number. But today, tomorrow, Friday, all day, all week, next week, it's going to be more helpful to think about it as distance from zero. Okay? So whenever we were reviewing for your finals last semester, we talked about some equations where we had the absolute value of x equals 3. You solved your equation, right? And this is what we ended up with. Okay? And we talked about that if the absolute value of x is 3, that means whatever x is, it is 3 units away from 0, right? So if I look at a number line and I start at 0, this number, whatever's inside here, is 3 steps away from 0. So I could start at 0, and I could go 3 steps to the right, 1, 2, 3, and I'd end up at 3. But that's not the only direction I can go, right? If you started at 0, and instead of walking to the right, you could also walk to the left, right? And we could go 1, 2, 3 steps to the left, and I could also end up at -3. Okay, so whenever we did that, we found out that if the absolute value of x is 3, x could be 3, or x could be -3. Which makes sense, because if you plug those values in for x, right, the absolute value of 3 is 3, and the absolute value of -3 is 3, right? We can always plug these answers back in and check if it makes sense. It should work out every time, okay? This makes sense? Ringing some bells here. Absolute value, distance from 0, okay? We're going to be doing this same idea here, but instead of just an x inside of the absolute value, there's going to be an expression in here, okay? But it doesn't change anything, okay? The only thing that it changes is we have to do a little bit more solving. So if we look at the absolute value of y minus 2 equals 4, what I want you guys to do is kind of ignore the y minus 2 part. This means the absolute value of this, ignore the y minus 2, something is 4 steps from 0, right? So once again, if I look at my number line, whatever this is, I could take 4 steps to the right, and I could be at 4. Or, once again, we could take 4 steps to the left, and we could be at -4, right? Whatever's inside here, ignore the y minus 2 part, this is either 4 or -4, right? Has to be. That's the only way. Whatever's inside this absolute value sign is either 4 or -4, okay? Well, what's inside here is y minus 2. So what this tells me is that y minus 2 could be equal to 4. Because remember, there could be a 4 inside here. Instead of y minus 2, it would be a 4. And that would be true. So I'm going to set y minus 2 equal to 4 because that's a possible solution. Or I also know that y minus 2 could also be -4. Because that's another possibility. Because if I take the absolute value of -4, I also get 4. Okay? So we actually have 2 equations, and we're just going to solve both of these. Okay? So for that first one, y minus 2 equals 4. If I add 2 to both sides, y equals 6. Or in the other one, if I add 2 to both sides, y equals -2. Okay, so all of your answers today, you'll have 2 of them. Remember, because if you have absolute value, there's 2 options. It could be the positive answer, or it could be the negative answer. Okay? Does this make sense? Okay? Yes?
Instead of writing the 2 different equations, could you just go right into solving and add 2 to both sides, and then have your options be the absolute value of y could be -4 or 4?
So you're saying add 2 from the beginning?
Yeah, like instead of writing two different equations.
Okay, so let's see if that works. So if instead we add 2 to both sides, because sometimes it's good just to try it. Okay, so if we add 2, is that what you're saying? Like this? So then I would have the absolute value of y equals 6. Well, if the absolute value of y is 6, what are my possible answers? 6 and negative 6. Do I get the same thing? No. So this does not work. And the reason why is because this absolute value is kind of its own little group. Okay? You can't take things out of the absolute value until you break it apart into your two equations. Okay? So that was a good question. And always good to just try. Okay? All right, are we ready to go on to some examples? Yes. Yeah, so if we plug these in, let's try this out because I should be able to plug these in and get the right answer. So if I plug 6 in for y, the absolute value of 6 minus 2 equals 4. 6 minus 2 is 4. Does the absolute value of 4 equal 4? Yeah. Okay, what if I plug in negative 2? Negative 2 minus 2, the absolute value of that should equal 4. Negative 2 minus 2 gives me negative 4. Does the absolute value of negative 4 give me 4? Yeah. So you can always check your answers. And a lot of these should be easy enough that maybe you don't even have to write it out, but you can check it mentally. Okay? That was a good question. Okay? Anything else? All right, let's move on. I have only 6 of these examples, which is good news for you guys. Okay, number 1. I have the absolute value of r plus 4 equals 1. Okay, so I am fully aware that these are all going to follow a pattern, and you will do the same thing for all these problems, and that's okay to do, but I want you guys to realize why we are doing that, okay? You guys will figure out probably after the second or third example that you're always going to set this equal to 1 and then set it equal to negative 1. But once again, let's think of why we're doing that, because if I look at a number line, absolute value means what? Distance from 0. So that means that whatever's inside here is 1 step away from 0. So if I take 1 step to the right, I would be at 1. And if I take 1 step to the left, I would be at negative 1, right? So whatever's inside there, whatever's inside these two vertical lines, is either has to be 1 or negative 1. That's the only thing it could be because that's the only thing that has an absolute value of 1. So that's why we take the r plus 4 and set it equal to 1. And then we go back and we set it equal to negative 1 because those are the things that are 1 step away from 0. Okay, once you set up this, then most of them are going to be solving a 1 or 2 step equation. So for the first one, r plus 4 equals 1. If I subtract 4 from both sides, I would have r equals negative 3. And for the other one, if I subtract 4 from both sides, r equals negative 5. And if we want to, we could go back and plug this back in. So the absolute value of negative 3 plus 4 should be equal to 1. Okay, negative 3 plus 4, what do I get? 1. Does the absolute value of 1 equal 1? Sure. Okay, if I plug in negative 5 plus 4 equals 1. What is negative 5 plus 4? Negative 1, right? And the absolute value of negative 1 also gives me 1. So you can check all of your answers today. So realistically, you shouldn't get any problems wrong on your homework tonight, right? Yes. Okay, questions on number 1? Okay, let's keep moving on. Okay, let's say we have the absolute value of x plus 7 equals 2. Okay, so remember, the absolute value of x plus 7 equals 2. Absolute value means distance from 0. So whatever's inside that set of parentheses is either 2 or negative 2, because both of those numbers are 2 steps from 0. So we're going to say x plus 7 could be 2, or x plus 7 could be negative 2. Okay, and if we go through and solve both of these, subtract 7, so we could have x could be negative 5, or subtract 7, x could be -9. Okay? Still making sense? Yes. Okay, we'll keep moving on. Number 3. All right, 8 minus k equals 5. I wouldn't even worry about how complicated whatever's inside here is until you set up your equations, okay? Because it doesn't matter what's inside there. I could have 2 pi times 3 squared times 49,352, and it doesn't matter. Whatever's inside here has an absolute value of 5. Whatever's inside here is 5 steps away from 0. So that means whatever's inside here could either be 5, because 5 is 5 steps to the right of 0, or it could be -5, because -5 is 5 steps to the left of 0. Okay? And now this one you have to be kind of careful when solving. How would you solve this first equation? Subtract 8, right? Because this is a positive 8. To get rid of a positive 8, we're going to subtract 8. What am I left with on the left-hand side? -k equals a -3. I don't want to know what -k equals. How do you get rid of that negative? You switch all the signs. Or what we're really doing is we're multiplying both sides by a -1, right? Okay, which is good to keep in mind when we start looking at these inequalities. So k could be 3. Or we're going to follow the same steps in that second equation. Subtract 8 from both sides. So I have -k equals a -5 minus 8. Gives me -13. Once again, I don't want a -k. I need a positive k. So k could be 13. So 3 and 13, yes?
If we get that negative on the k, do we have to show the -1 thing?
I think it's good to show that. It's good to practice this because with the equations, yeah, we know we're going to flip the signs. But remember what happens if this is an inequality? What else do we have to do if this were an inequality instead of an equation? What happens if you multiply or divide both sides of an inequality by a negative number? You have to flip the sign too. So sometimes it's nice to show that you're multiplying by a -1. So it takes an extra second. I would like you to show this step. Okay? All right, halfway through. Only a few more left. Okay, number 4. The absolute value of 5x minus 3 equals 17. Okay, so remember, this is a little more complicated inside the absolute value sign, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if there's an x inside there, if there's a 2x inside there, if there's a 5x minus 3 inside there. We're going to follow the same steps because whatever's inside there is 17 steps from 0. So if I went 17 steps to the right, I know that 5x minus 3 would be equal to 17. If instead I walk the opposite direction, 5x minus 3 would be a -17. Okay? Now these are just two-step equations. So if I look at this first equation, what would you have to get rid of first? The 3. How would you get rid of the 3? Add 3 to both sides. So 5x equals 20. Divide both sides by 5. So x equals 4. And for the second equation, it's not 13, it's 3. What would you do first in that second equation? Add 3. You follow the same steps, don't we? We follow the same steps. 5x equals -14. Same steps, just different numbers. Divide both sides by 5. We get x equals -14 over 5. You can leave your answers as an improper fraction. You do need to make sure they're simplified. Okay, so what I mean by that, let's say, completely separate from this problem, you end up with x equals 6 over 4. Okay, you don't have to write it as a mixed number, but 6 and 4 have a common factor, don't they? You can divide out of 2. So you would need to write it as 3/2. You do not have to change it to a mixed number. Okay? Questions on number 4? Okay, just a couple more. All right, let's try the absolute value of 8k equals 16. The absolute value of 8k equals 16. What would your equations look like for this one? We have two equations. What do they look like? I couldn't hear you. What do they look like? What are my two possibilities here? 8k could be 16. 8k could be negative 16, right? And for both of these, we would divide by 8. K could be 2, or k could be negative 2. Okay, some of them will be pretty easy. Okay, questions on number 5. And last one, number 6. The absolute value of u over 3 plus 4 equals 1. Okay, for this one, what are my two equations? What would my two equations look like? U over 3 plus 4 equals 1, or u over 3 plus 4 could be negative 1. Okay, well, let's go through and solve this one's together. For that first one, what would you have to get rid of first? The 4. How would you get rid of the 4? Subtract 4 from both sides. So I have u over 3 equals negative 3. How do I get rid of that 3? Multiply, right? We use inverse operations. So instead of divide by 3, we're going to multiply both sides by 3. So I know that u could be negative 9. And then, like I've said a couple times, you actually followed the same step. So if I subtracted 4 first in that first equation, we're going to subtract 4 first in the second equation. So I have u over 3 equals negative 5. Multiply both sides by 3. So u could be negative 15. Okay, any questions on any of these examples we've talked about today?